Part 1: The Road to Stalingrad. World War II was the deadliest, most brutal conflict in human history. And within that war, few battles matched the sheer violence and devastation of the Battle of Stalingrad, a clash so immense it shifted the course of the entire conflict. Taking place between August 1942 and February 1943, it wasn't just a turning point in WW2, it was one of the most significant military engagements of the 20th century. So, what exactly happened in Stalingrad? How did the Soviet Union hold its ground against the seemingly unstoppable German war machine? Let's start from the lead up. In early December 1941, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow. Under Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany had launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, aiming to quickly crush the Red Army and seize the Soviet capital. But the Soviet winter and fierce resistance turned the tide. The Red Army counterattacked, pushing the Germans away from Moscow's outskirts. Though this Soviet counteroffensive was a major morale booster, it came at a huge cost. The Red Army suffered staggering losses. By spring 1942, both sides were battered. The Red Army's counteroffensive had ground to a halt, and the Germans had regrouped. They held large swaths of Soviet territory, including Ukraine and parts of the Crimean Peninsula. While cities like Sevastopol and parts of the Kerch Peninsula were still under Soviet control, much of the south had fallen into German hands. The front lines had stabilized from Leningrad in the north to Rostov in the south, with some bulges near Moscow and Kharkiv. But these pockets didn't pose a major threat to the German southern push. At this point, Hitler realized something critical. His dream of a swift blitzkrieg victory over the Soviet Union wasn't going to happen. The Red Army wasn't collapsing. It was bleeding, yes, but it was still fighting. So the German strategy shifted from rapid conquest to a war of attrition. Hitler needed to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to sustain its war effort, its manpower, its industries, and above all, its resources. That's where Operation Blue came in the German summer offensive of 1942. The primary goal: seize the Soviet Union's vital southern regions. Hitler wanted Ukraine's grain and coal, but more importantly, he wanted the oil fields in the Caucasus. Oil was the lifeblood of modern warfare, and without it, tanks stopped rolling, planes stopped flying, and armies stopped moving. But there was one city standing in the way of that southern push: Stalingrad. Stalingrad wasn't just any city. It was a massive industrial hub on the western bank of the Volga River, a vital transport artery connecting the Caspian Sea to the rest of Russia. Whoever controlled the Volga controlled the Soviet Union's ability to move resources north and west. More than that, Stalingrad had symbolic weight. It bore the name of Joseph Stalin himself. For Hitler, capturing the city would be more than a strategic gain. It would be a personal blow to Stalin and a psychological blow to the Soviet people. For the Red Army, losing Stalingrad was unthinkable. The Soviet high command understood the city's strategic value and what its fall would mean. If the Germans took Stalingrad, they'd have a secure flank from which to push deeper into the oil-rich Caucasus. They'd also split Soviet forces in two and compromise vital supply routes. But more than that, Stalingrad had become a symbol of resistance. Stalin himself is said to have ordered that not a single step back be taken. It would be defended at all costs. By the spring of 1942, the Soviets were in a desperate situation. The winter counteroffensive had drained their manpower. Losses were high, and the economy was under immense strain. To prepare for the German summer offensive, the Soviets launched massive mobilization efforts. Anyone who could hold a weapon, men, women, and even teenagers, was sent to the front or to the defense of key cities like Stalingrad. At the time, the Soviet Red Army still lagged behind the Wehrmacht in terms of high-mobility operations. The Germans had better logistics, superior training, and more effective combined arms tactics. But the Soviets had one key advantage: they were defending urban terrain. In a city, tanks are less useful. Long-range artillery is less effective. What matters is infantry grit and street-by-street fighting. And the Soviets were ready to fight for every inch. And that's exactly what happened. As the Germans pushed toward Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, they swept through southern Ukraine and into the Caucasus. Soviet positions in Odessa and Crimea crumbled. The German army group south surged forward. By May, they had dealt a heavy blow to the Soviet Bryansk and Vyazma sectors in the north and stabilized the Leningrad front. That freed up German divisions for the southern offensive. The Soviets, meanwhile, had blundered with a poorly planned offensive in the Barvankovo-Lotsovaya region, often referred to as the Second Battle of Kharkov. The goal was to retake territory and push back the Germans in the southwest, but it backfired. Soviet forces were encircled, suffering catastrophic losses. Not only did the campaign wipe out much of the Red Army's northern flank on the southern front, but it also left the entire region dangerously exposed. The German High Command saw the opportunity and prepared to strike deep into Soviet territory with Stalingrad in their sights. The pressure was mounting. Soviet reserves were stretched thin. Morale was low, and the city's fate now rested on whether or not its defenders could hold back the coming tide. As we move forward in the story, we'll dive into how the battle for the city itself began, how brutal house-to-house combat, sniper duels, and endless artillery fire turned Stalingrad into a living hell. By the summer of 1942, the German Wehrmacht was pushing towards Stalingrad with relentless force. After their early successes in Ukraine and Crimea, Hitler split his southern forces into two groups: Army Group A, tasked with seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus, and Army Group B, which was ordered to capture Stalingrad. This decision splitting his forces would later prove to be a critical mistake. But at the time, the momentum seemed to be on Germany's side. As German forces approached, the Volga Soviet military leadership began organizing the defense of Stalingrad in earnest. Command was handed to General Vasily Chuikov, a tough and pragmatic leader who understood exactly what kind of battle they were about to fight. Chuikov knew the Red Army couldn't match German firepower head-on in open terrain, but in the ruined, cramped spaces of a shattered city, they had a fighting chance. His strategy was simple and brutal: hug the enemy. That meant getting as close to the Germans as possible, so close that German artillery and air power couldn't be used without hitting their own troops. The Germans under General Friedrich Paulus were confident. Backed by the feared Luftwaffe German Air Force, they launched heavy air raids to soften up the city before the infantry, and armored divisions moved in. On August 23, 1942, the bombing began. In a single day, thousands of civilians were killed as the Luftwaffe flattened large portions of Stalingrad. The city was turned into a twisted maze of rubble-shattered buildings and fire, and ironically, that destruction would become the Soviets' greatest ally. The urban battlefield that emerged in the aftermath was a nightmare for the Germans. Every block, every building, every basement became a battlefield. Soviet snipers, most famously Vasily Zaitsev, turned the ruins into hunting grounds. Machine gun nests were hidden behind crumbling walls, and Soviet soldiers would appear from tunnels, sewers, and even under collapsed floors. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War, because that's what it felt like: an endless, chaotic maze where death could come from anywhere. But the German advance didn't stop. By September, they had captured most of the city's outskirts and were pushing toward the center. The Red Army, though, refused to break. Reinforcements were ferried across the Volga River under constant fire. The river itself became a death zone. German planes strafed the waters daily, sinking ferries and killing thousands of troops before they could even reach the battlefield. Chuikov's men held on grimly to critical parts of the city. The most famous of these was the Mamayev Kurgan, a strategic hill that changed hands multiple times, and Pavlov's house, a four-story apartment building that a group of Soviet soldiers held for nearly 2 months against endless German assaults. The building became a symbol of Soviet resistance, and it was said that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they had during the invasion of Paris. The fighting was beyond brutal. In some cases, soldiers fought for hours or even days over a single stairwell. Grenades, knives, even hand-to-hand combat became common. Soldiers lived among the corpses of their comrades, often unable to bury the dead due to constant shelling and sniper fire. Civilians who had not fled were trapped in the city, hiding in cellars and ruins, scavenging for food and trying to survive as hell unfolded around them. By October 1942, the German army believed they were close to victory. They controlled more than 90% of the city. Paulus reported to Hitler that final victory was within reach. But this is where things began to unravel. While the Germans were bogged down in the city, the Soviet High Command Stavka was planning a massive counteroffensive. Their strategy hinged on one crucial realization. While the Germans were strong inside Stalingrad, their flanks, the areas north and south of the city, were held by weaker Axis allies, Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian divisions. These units were poorly equipped, less experienced, and stretched thin. If these flanks could be broken, the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad could be encircled. The plan was bold. It was called Operation Uranus. While German forces continued their slow, painful crawl through Stalingrad, tens of thousands of Soviet troops and hundreds of tanks were quietly being positioned outside the city. The Soviets knew they couldn't win by brute force inside Stalingrad alone. They had to outmaneuver the enemy strategically. By November 1942, the trap was set. German commanders were so focused on the fight inside the city that they ignored intelligence reports suggesting a major Soviet buildup. Hitler himself refused to believe the Soviets had the manpower or logistics to mount a serious offensive. But they did, and what came next would change the war. In mid-November, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, attacking the weak Romanian lines to the north and south. The Soviet breakthroughs were immediate and devastating. In a matter of days, the Soviet forces swept around Stalingrad in a massive pincer movement encircling the entire German Sixth Army, nearly 300,000 Axis troops inside the city. Paulus and his men were trapped. The German High Command was stunned. What had looked like certain victory had suddenly become a catastrophic defeat in the making. The once mighty German Sixth Army, which had nearly taken the entire city, now found itself surrounded with no way out and winter fast approaching. And so began a new chapter of the Battle of Stalingrad, not just a battle for a city, but a fight for survival, as the freezing, starving German forces awaited a rescue that would never come. Part 3. The Noose Titans. Starvation, Snow, and Surrender. By late November 1942, the German Sixth Army was completely encircled in Stalingrad. Operation Uranus had succeeded beyond even Soviet expectations. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis soldiers, including Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians, were now trapped inside the ruins of a city they had nearly conquered. Hitler had promised his armies glory and victory. Instead, they now faced one of the harshest winters in Russian history, with little food, no supplies, and no clear way out. At first, the German High Command refused to accept the reality of the situation. Hitler ordered Paulus to hold the city at all costs. Retreat was forbidden. The Führer insisted that the Luftwaffe under the command of Hermann Göring could supply the Sixth Army from the air. It was a fatal assumption. The Luftwaffe promised to deliver 300 tons of supplies per day, but in truth they could barely manage 80 tons and sometimes far less. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns made sure that very few transport planes made it in or out without being shot down. Fuel, food, and ammunition quickly ran dry. German soldiers began rationing bread down to 100 grams a day, roughly a slice and a half, and even that wasn't guaranteed. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Eventually, soldiers resorted to boiling belts and leather boots to survive. Frostbite ran rampant. Amputations became common. The temperatures often dropped to 30 degrees, 22 degrees, and many German troops didn't even have proper winter clothing. Despite these horrific conditions, Hitler remained delusional. He was obsessed with the idea that Stalingrad must be held not for strategic reasons, but for symbolic ones. The city bore Stalin's name, and its capture had become a matter of personal pride. He believed that holding Stalingrad would inspire the rest of the German military and demoralize the Soviets. Meanwhile, the Soviets were preparing the next phase of their campaign. In December 1942, they launched Operation Little Saturn, which aimed to destroy the Axis armies to the west of Stalingrad, mainly the Italians and remnants of the Romanians. The offensive was successful and further crippled Germany's ability to mount a rescue. Back in the city, the German Sixth Army was slowly dying. Disease spread, typhus, dysentery, and lice plagued the men. Wounded soldiers lay untreated in freezing basements, many dying within hours. Hospitals, if they could even be called that, were filled with the dead and dying. Morale collapsed. Letters from home stopped arriving. Soldiers began to feel abandoned, not just by their leaders, but by their country. Still, the Red Army didn't rush the final attack. They didn't have to. Time hunger and cold were doing their work. But in January 1943, Stalin gave the order to crush the pocket completely. The Soviets launched a massive offensive, overwhelming artillery tanks, and fresh troops began pushing inward from all sides. The ring around the Germans tightened with each passing day. Inside the encirclement, Paulus faced an impossible choice. He requested permission to surrender. Hitler refused. He promoted Paulus to field marshal, reminding him that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, a clear hint that he was expected to commit suicide rather than be taken alive. But Paulus didn't. On January 31st, 1943, realizing the situation was hopeless and unwilling to sacrifice the lives of the remaining 90,000 men under his command, Paulus surrendered to the Soviets. 2 days later, the last pockets of German resistance in Stalingrad were eliminated. The once mighty German Sixth Army, one of the most powerful formations in Hitler's military, had been completely annihilated. Of the 300,000 Axis troops originally encircled, only about 90,000 surrendered. And of those, fewer than 5,000 would survive Soviet captivity and return home after the war. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The Soviets had won, but the victory came at an unfathomable cost. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Civilian deaths were in the hundreds of thousands. The city of Stalingrad itself was left in ruins. Barely a building stood untouched. Smoke still hung in the air for months after the last gunshots were fired. But it was a turning point not just in the war, but in world history. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end. After Stalingrad, the Nazi war machine was never again able to fully recover. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Countries around the world, from Britain to the United States, saw that the Nazis could be beaten and that the Soviets were a force to be reckoned with. For the Soviet Union, the victory was both a rallying cry and a source of national pride. It proved they could defend their homeland even in the darkest of times. It gave Stalin immense political power. It transformed the Red Army into an unstoppable offensive force that would, over the next 2 years, push all the way to Berlin. But above all, the Battle of Stalingrad stands as a testament to human endurance, the will to survive in impossible conditions, to resist against overwhelming odds, and to sacrifice everything for the chance at freedom, or simply another day alive. In the ruins of Stalingrad, history was rewritten. Part 4. Picking up the pieces. What came after Stalingrad? In the bitter cold of early February 1943, as the last German units in Stalingrad laid down their arms, the world began to realize that something monumental had just occurred. The Soviet victory wasn't just a military success, it was a powerful psychological shift. For the first time since the war had begun, the Nazi juggernaut had been decisively and publicly stopped. But now the question became what came next. Across Germany, the news of the surrender was met with disbelief. Nazi propaganda had promised victory. Hitler had declared that Stalingrad would never fall, and yet it had. For many German citizens, this was the first moment they began to doubt the narrative they'd been fed for years. The myth of invincibility was gone, replaced by grief, anger, and uncertainty. But inside Hitler's inner circle, there was no acceptance, only fury. Hitler was enraged at Paulus for surrendering. He had expected him to die with his troops to set an example of loyalty and martyrdom. Instead, Paulus was captured alive and would later speak out against the Nazi regime while in Soviet captivity. This betrayal hit Hitler hard. He couldn't comprehend that anyone might prioritize human life over his own personal ideology. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had won the battle, but they hadn't won the war. The Red Army had proven that it could not only defend, but also counterattack. Still, the losses were staggering. Entire divisions had been wiped out. The population of Stalingrad, once around 500,000, had been reduced to mere thousands of starving, shell-shocked survivors. The city itself was a ghost town, a scar on the landscape filled with rubble bodies and silence. But the Soviet leadership didn't waste time mourning. Instead, they prepared. Stalingrad had shifted the balance of power, and Stalin intended to press the advantage. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, the Soviets regrouped, refitted, and replenished their ranks with fresh troops and American-supplied equipment through the Lend-Lease program, including trucks, canned food boots, and communication gear. It wasn't glamorous, but it helped keep Soviet logistics flowing, and that would soon matter more than ever. For the Germans, the loss of the Sixth Army created a giant hole on the Eastern Front. They had lost hundreds of thousands of trained men, and many more in supporting roles across the Southern Front. It wasn't just a military loss, it was a loss of experience, morale, and momentum. The Wehrmacht, once confident and ruthless, now had to contend with something they hadn't faced before retreat. Still, Hitler refused to shift strategies. He believed the war could still be won not through diplomacy or caution, but with one more decisive battle. This belief led to the planning of Operation Citadel, the German counteroffensive at Kursk, in July 1943. It was to be the largest tank battle in history, an attempt to regain control, smash the Red Army, and reverse the psychological damage of Stalingrad. But the Soviets had learned from their mistakes. They had spies feeding them German plans. They dug in laid mines, built trenches, and massed armor. When the Germans attacked at Kursk, they were met not with surprise, but with solid, organized resistance. The Red Army stopped the offensive cold and then launched their own. The failure at Kursk marked the final nail in the coffin of German offensive power on the Eastern Front. From that point forward, the Soviets would be the ones pushing west through Ukraine into Poland and eventually straight into Berlin. But Stalingrad didn't just affect the East. In the West, the Allies, especially Britain and the United States, saw the Soviet victory as a clear signal. The USSR wasn't going to fall. They were not just holding the line anymore, they were breaking it. This influenced Allied planning and led to a renewed push for a second front in Western Europe. By 1944, this would culminate in the D-Day invasion of Normandy, opening a new path into Hitler's Europe from the west, while the Soviets advanced from the east. Stalingrad also had ripple effects throughout the Axis alliance. Italy, already struggling militarily and economically, began to crumble. Mussolini's government would collapse later in 1943. Romania, Hungary, and other German allies started to reconsider their loyalty. Fear crept in, even among the highest ranks of the German command. And for the Soviets themselves, the victory brought enormous propaganda value. Stalingrad was hailed as the Great Patriotic War's defining moment. Posters, songs, films, and speeches turned the battle into legend. Statues would be built, cities renamed, and generations of children taught about the bravery of those who fought among the ruins. Stalingrad became more than a place, it became a symbol of resistance, sacrifice, and survival. But for the men who had fought there, both Soviet and German, the reality was far less romantic. Survivors on both sides carried the trauma of Stalingrad with them for the rest of their lives. The veterans who returned, if they returned at all, bore the scars, physical and mental, of a battle that was closer to hell than war. Soviet soldiers spoke of nightmarish close quarters, fighting of comrades dying beside them, of snipers in every window. German prisoners, those few who survived Soviet captivity, told of starvation sickness and years in labor camps. Many never spoke of it at all. Some couldn't. The ruins of Stalingrad would eventually be rebuilt. The city was renamed Volgograd in 1961 as part of the Soviet Union's de-Stalinization. But the name Stalingrad still holds power, a word that evokes one of the most intense and defining moments in human history. Stalingrad wasn't just a military turning point, it was a turning point for humanity. It forced the world to confront the cost of war, not in numbers or strategies, but in human suffering. It was the moment the tide turned, when the unstoppable was finally stopped, and the course of history began to shift. And in that shattered city by the Volga River, surrounded by ash and ice, the future of the world was decided. Part 5. The Ghosts of Stalingrad. How the battle changed the world. After the ruins settled and the gunfire fell silent over the devastated city of Stalingrad, something intangible lingered in the air, a sense that the world had changed forever. The battle wasn't just a moment in a timeline, it was a crack in history. And through that crack, something new emerged, the beginning of Nazi Germany's fall, and the rebirth of the Soviet Union as a global superpower. But let's be clear, the cost was staggering. By the end of the battle, it's estimated that over 2 million people were killed, wounded, or missing. That includes soldiers and civilians, Germans and Soviets. The numbers are so massive they almost lose meaning, but each one was a life, a face, a story, a future cut short. The ruins of Stalingrad weren't just rubble, they were a graveyard for an entire generation, and the battle had done something to those who survived it. Soviet soldiers who had fought street by street, building by building, often came back with a kind of quiet intensity. Some never talked about it, others couldn't stop. The trauma wasn't just from the violence, it was from the cold, the hunger, the feeling that every second could be your last. And for the German POWs, the nightmare was far from over. Many of them would not return home until a decade later, and some never returned at all. In Germany, the blow from Stalingrad landed like a hammer. Nazi propaganda tried to spin the defeat, claiming the German soldiers had fulfilled their duty to the fatherland. But people weren't fooled. Mothers waited for letters that never came. Wives listened to radio broadcasts in silence. Soldiers began to question the orders they were given. A crack had formed not just in the front lines, but in the faith that had kept Germany marching forward. And for Hitler, the defeat triggered something darker. He became more erratic, more controlling. His distrust of his generals grew, and his military decisions started reflecting paranoia instead of strategy. He refused to retreat even when logic demanded it. He began issuing no-surrender orders more frequently, as if by sheer will he could force victory back into his hands. But Stalingrad had proved something important. Reality could not be bent forever. In the Soviet Union, however, Stalingrad was a kind of resurrection. Stalin, once on the defensive, now stood tall. The Red Army, battered and bruised, had done the unthinkable. They had stopped the most powerful army in Europe. Confidence surged through the ranks. Morale soared. For the first time in the war, Soviet soldiers didn't just believe they could survive, they believed they could win. And they did more than believe. They started pushing west. In the months following Stalingrad, a string of Soviet offensives began retaking ground across Ukraine and Belarus. Every mile regained was paid in blood, but the direction was now clear. The Red Army was not retreating anymore. They were coming city by city, bridge by bridge, trench by trench, and they wouldn't stop until they reached Berlin. But Stalingrad's impact wasn't limited to the Eastern Front. For the Western Allies, especially the United States and Britain, the victory was a revelation. Before, there had been fears that the Soviet Union might collapse, that Germany would seize Moscow, and that the war might be lost in the East. But after Stalingrad, those fears faded. The USSR had proven itself, not just as a capable ally, but as a formidable power in its own right. This helped shape the rest of the war. Plans for a second front in Western Europe, something Stalin had been demanding for years, were accelerated. The Americans and British realized that they needed to move fast, not just to beat Germany, but to prevent the Soviets from taking too much of Europe. Stalingrad had changed the political chessboard, and everyone knew it. In fact, that single battle would later become one of the seeds of the Cold War. You see, after the dust settled and World War II came to an end, the alliance between the West and the USSR quickly turned into tension. The two sides had different visions for the post-war world, and behind those visions was a simple truth: the Soviet Union had sacrificed more, lost more, and bled more than any other nation in the war. And Stalingrad had been the crucible of that sacrifice. To the Soviets, it gave them legitimacy. To the West, it made them wary. But long before the Cold War began, Stalingrad had already left its mark on warfare. It forced generals around the world to rethink their strategies. Gone were the days of purely maneuver-based battles. Stalingrad was proof that urban warfare, brutal, slow, and destructive, could determine the fate of entire nations. Future military doctrines would never ignore that lesson again. It also reshaped how the world viewed resilience. Stalingrad was not a tale of tactical brilliance or high-tech weaponry. It was a story of grit, of soldiers clinging to shattered walls and freezing trenches, refusing to give ground even when outgunned and outnumbered. It was about ordinary people, factory workers, farmers, teenagers picking up rifles and defending their homes with whatever they had. It reminded the world that victory isn't always about firepower. Sometimes it's about will. And that will in Stalingrad was forged in fire. Today, if you go to Volgograd, the modern name for Stalingrad, you'll find monuments towering over the landscape. The most famous is the Motherland Calls, a massive statue of a woman holding a sword aloft, calling her sons to battle. It's not just a statue, it's a symbol of defiance of memory of history carved into stone. But the real legacy of Stalingrad isn't found in monuments. It's found in the stories passed down from veterans, from families, from historians. It's found in the silence of the rebuilt streets where once every corner was a battlefield. It's found in the lessons etched into military academies, into books, into the collective memory of a world forever changed. Stalingrad was more than just a turning point in World War II. It was a turning point in the human story. Because when everything burned, when hope seemed lost, when the world tilted toward darkness, a battered, starving army stood its ground. And the world was never the same again. Part 6. Aftermath and Echoes. The Long Shadow of Stalingrad. After the last shot was fired and the last German unit surrendered, the Battle of Stalingrad didn't simply end, it echoed. Through the ashes and into the years that followed, its impact rippled across military strategy, political alliances, and the very psyche of the nations involved. The Soviet Union had won, but at a cost so massive that it nearly bled the country dry. Entire divisions were wiped out. Families vanished. Cities had been turned into ghost towns. But from that carnage came something rare in history, not just a strategic victory, but a cultural one. Stalingrad became a symbol of survival, of sacrifice, of the ability to stare death in the face and refuse to blink. And that symbol was carefully cultivated. The Soviet government turned the victory into a national myth. Stalingrad was taught in schools, memorialized in songs, poems, film statues. Soldiers who had survived were honored as heroes. Mothers who had lost sons were remembered as pillars of strength. The city itself, though devastated, was rebuilt with pride and renamed Volgograd in 1961, but even today in memory and reverence it's still Stalingrad to millions. For Germany, the defeat was something different, a reckoning. Stalingrad shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility. Up until then, Hitler's military had seemed unstoppable, sweeping across Europe like a tidal wave. But Stalingrad proved there was a limit to that momentum, and once the machine broke, it couldn't be fixed. More importantly, it broke the trust between Hitler and his generals. After Stalingrad, Hitler became more isolated in his decision-making. He stopped listening to experienced military advisors, believing that only he understood the path to victory. He demanded total obedience. He replaced strategy with fanaticism, and that fanaticism would ultimately be Germany's undoing. As the Red Army advanced westward following their victory, the war shifted. The Germans were now the ones defending, falling back, retreating from city after city. The myth of German superiority built over years of conquest crumbled brick by brick. The Wehrmacht was still deadly, still dangerous, but now it was bleeding too. And the wound opened at Stalingrad never fully closed. Stalingrad also changed how the world fought wars. Before this battle, military planners thought in terms of sweeping movements, flanking maneuvers, fast strikes, mass encirclements. But Stalingrad showed the horror and effectiveness of urban warfare. Close combat, room-to-room fighting. Logistics stretched to the breaking point. Supplies dropped in by night. Casualties so high that soldiers were told, "You will replace the man in front of you when he falls." Future wars, especially in cities, would bear this scar. From the ruins of Berlin in 1945 to the shattered buildings of Grozny or Fallujah, decades later the lessons of Stalingrad would shape tactics, expectations, and rules of engagement. Politically, the battle redrew the map of influence in Europe. The Allies, the US, UK, and USSR had already begun working together before Stalingrad, but the Soviet victory shifted the balance. Stalin now had more leverage. He had proven that the Red Army could do more than defend, it could destroy. And as the Soviet front advanced toward Berlin, it became clear that wherever the Red Army stopped, Soviet influence would begin. That's exactly what happened. By the time Germany surrendered in 1945, Soviet troops occupied much of Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Balkans, and of course East Germany. These weren't temporary occupations. They became part of the Eastern Bloc, controlled either directly or indirectly by the Soviet Union. And while the Western Allies watched cautiously, they couldn't ignore the truth. Without the Red Army, the Nazis might never have been stopped. But that cooperation wouldn't last. The seeds of distrust had already been planted, and they bloomed into the Cold War. A world divided not just by geography, but ideology, capitalism versus communism, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, the US and Britain on one side, the Soviet Union on the other. Stalingrad had been a victory, but it had also marked the beginning of a global tension that would last for the next 45 years. Culturally, the battle became a touchstone for understanding courage and cruelty. In the decades after the war, books and films began to explore Stalingrad not just as a military clash, but as a human tragedy. Memoirs from Soviet and German soldiers painted a picture of frozen trenches, constant fearmen, starving in basements praying for warmth, for rescue, for silence. Survivors remembered eating rats. They remembered hallucinating from cold. They remembered the sounds of boots crunching over snow mixed with shattered glass. It wasn't about glory, it was about endurance. And it changed how we tell war stories. Before, war films often glorified victory. After Stalingrad, they showed suffering ambiguity, the blurred line between right and wrong. Soldiers on both sides were often portrayed not as heroes or villains, but as young men thrown into a nightmare beyond their understanding. And that narrative reshaped modern war literature. Even today, Stalingrad is studied in military academies around the world. Not just for tactics, but for its deeper lessons about morale, about logistics, about resilience. Commanders analyze how Hitler's obsession with symbolic victory led to strategic disaster. They study how the Soviets used terrain weather and timing to turn the tide. They look at the failure of hubris and the triumph of will. Because ultimately that's what Stalingrad came down to. Not who had the most tanks, not who had the best generals, but who refused to give up. And that's why more than 80 years later we still talk about it. We still walk through the ruins. We still write the stories. We still ask how did they endure it? And maybe deep down we ask ourselves something else. If it had been us, would we have done the same? Stalingrad wasn't just the bloodiest battle of World War II. It was the soul of it. It was where everything changed and where a new world began.